The wind in the Wyoming Territory had teeth in December. It was not a wind that simply chilled the skin. It bit clear to the bone. A relentless predator that hunted across the vast, frozen plains and funneled itself down the single muddy street of Ash Hollow. The mud was hard as iron, scarred with the ruts of wagon wheels frozen in place since the last thaw weeks ago. In the distance, the Bighorn Mountains were a jagged line of broken teeth against a pale, merciless sky. Winter had the town in its grip, and it was squeezing hard. Nora Hayes felt the pressure in her chest with every shallow breath. She held her son Eli's hand, his small fingers a fragile warmth inside her own worn glove. At 29, Nora looked older. The prairie had a way of stealing youth, leaving behind a stark resilience in its place. Her face, framed by a plain wool bonnet, was thin, but her jaw was set. Pride was all she had left, and it was a poor substitute for a sack of flour. Eli, who was 7, walked with a quietness that did not belong in a boy his age. He did not complain about the cold or the long walk from their homestead, a place that was little more than a drafty cabin clinging to the edge of nowhere. He simply watched his mother's face, his own expression a small, serious mirror of her own. Their destination was the largest building in Ash Hollow, Pritchard's Mercantile. It was a long, false-fronted structure that promised everything a body could need, from nails and coffee to calico and cartridges. The promise, Nora knew, was conditional. As she pushed the heavy door open, a bell jangled overhead, announcing their arrival to the handful of people inside. The warmth from the pot-bellied stove was a physical blow. A thick, comforting wave that smelled of roasting coffee beans, cured leather, and damp wool. For a moment, she let herself soak it in, the first real warmth she had felt all day. Asa Pritchard stood behind the long oak counter, a man as dry and stacked as the goods on his shelves. He was not an unkind man by nature, but he was a businessman, and his ledger was his Bible. He offered Nora a curt nod, his eyes flicking down to Eli before returning to her. Mrs. Hayes. Around the stove sat a few of the town's more permanent fixtures. Frank Dawson, a hired hand for the Big Morrison Ranch, was tilted back in his chair, his spurs scratching the floorboards. He watched Nora with an unearned familiarity, a lazy smile playing on his lips. Sheriff Hale was there too, meticulously polishing the star on his chest, a man more concerned with the appearance of order than its substance. And near the bolts of fabric stood a trio of the town's good ladies, their conversation dropping to a conspiratorial whisper the moment Nora entered. Their piety was a weapon, and their gossip was its ammunition. Nora walked directly to the counter, keeping her back to the others. She did not want them to see the faint tremor in her hands. She kept her voice low, meant for Pritchard alone. "Mr. Pritchard, I need to ask for a little credit, just until I can get some mending work. Some flour, some cornmeal, lard." Pritchard did not look at his ledger. He did not need to. He sighed, a sound of practiced regret. He raised his voice just enough for the entire store to hear, a subtle performance of his own prudence. "Now, Nora, you know I cannot do that. The books are closed. Your husband's account was settled, and that was that. Times are hard for everyone." The silence that followed was absolute. The whispers of the women ceased. The scratching of Dawson's spurs stopped. Even Sheriff Hale paused his polishing. Every eye in the room was on her. Nora felt the heat rise in her cheeks, a flush of shame so intense it was painful. It was not just a refusal. It was a public declaration of her failure. She was a widow who could not provide, a homesteader who could not make a go of it. In their eyes, she was becoming a burden. She saw it in the smug satisfaction on Frank Dawson's face and the cool judgment in the women's stares. They were watching her break. She would not give them the satisfaction. Across the street, a man leaned against a veranda post, half hidden in the long afternoon shadow of the livery stable. Colt Mercer had been in town for 2 days, waiting for a blacksmith to fix a broken axle on a supply wagon he was escorting north. He was a tall man, built with the dense, unyielding strength of an old oak. His face was weathered by sun and wind, his eyes a pale, steady blue that missed nothing. He had seen the woman and the boy walk into town, had noted the straightness of her back and the thinness of the boy's coat. Now, through the mercantile's large front window, he saw the scene unfold. He did not feel pity. Pity was a soft, useless thing. What he felt was a slow, cold anger. He had seen this play before in a dozen other dusty towns. He saw the self-righteous flock preening over their own security while one of their own was pushed to the edge. He saw a woman standing alone, not asking for a handout, but for a chance, and being denied for the sport of it. He saw the injustice of it, plain and simple as a rattlesnake in the trail. Surviving was one thing. He knew all about that, but this slow, public strangling of a person's spirit was something else entirely. It was not living. Inside the store, Nora gathered the last shreds of her composure. She met Pritchard's gaze, her own clear and cold. "I understand," she said, her voice even. She did not look at the others. She turned, took Eli's hand, and walked toward the door. The jangle of the bell as she left sounded like a final judgment. The cold outside was a relief, a clean sting against her hot face. She pulled her threadbare shawl tighter and started to step off the boardwalk into the street, her mind a blank canvas of despair. The walk home stretched before her, an impossible journey that ended at a cold hearth and an empty larder. It was then that a shadow detached itself from the livery. Colt Mercer pushed off the post and crossed the street. His steps were measured, his worn boots making a solid, crunching sound on the frozen ground. He did not hurry. He simply moved with a quiet purpose that made people notice. He stopped a few feet in front of her, not blocking her way, but making it impossible for her to ignore him. The wind whipped a loose strand of brown hair across Nora's cheek. Eli pressed closer to her side, his eyes wide as he looked up at the tall, quiet stranger. Colt said nothing for a long moment, letting the wind do the talking. He looked at her, his gaze direct but not invasive. He saw the pride warring with desperation in her eyes. He saw the strength she was trying so hard to hold on to. Then he spoke, and his voice was low and calm, a solid thing in the biting air, carrying no trace of pity, only a simple, profound acknowledgement of her existence. "Ma'am." That single word, spoken so plainly, stopped Nora in her tracks. She turned her head slowly, regarding the man who had spoken it. He was a stranger, and in her experience, strangers in this part of the country rarely offered comfort without a price. His clothes were worn but clean, the clothes of a working man, and he stood with a stillness that was somehow more commanding than any loud gesture. She saw no pity in his pale eyes, only a level, assessing gaze that seemed to take in the whole of her situation in one glance. "I am fine," she said, her voice tight with the pride she was clinging to so fiercely. It was a lie, and they both knew it. He did not challenge her. His gaze shifted from her face to the small boy at her side. Eli had stopped trying to hide behind her skirts and was staring openly at the man. Colt's expression softened almost imperceptibly. He crouched down, not all the way, but enough to bring himself a little closer to the boy's level. "That is a thin coat for a wind like this," he said, his voice still low, but directed now at Eli. The boy just blinked. Colt looked back up at Nora. "You have a hearth to warm." "We have a hearth," she confirmed, her tone defensive. "And wood to burn in it." Enough for tonight. Another lie, but a necessary one. He nodded, accepting the lie without comment. He straightened to his full height again, his presence casting a long shadow as the afternoon sun began to bleed away behind the mountains. The wind howled down the street, whipping dust and ice crystals against the wooden buildings. He moved a step closer, into the relative shelter of the livery's overhanging roof, and gestured for her to join him, reluctantly. She did, pulling Eli with her. Out of the direct assault of the wind, the world seemed a fraction quieter, a fraction more survivable. He looked directly into her eyes, and the frankness of his gaze made it impossible for her to look away. He had seen what happened in the mercantile. He had heard Pritchard's loud refusal. He was not here by accident. "A fire does not do much good on an empty stomach," he said, his voice dropping so low it was almost lost in the wind's cry. He spoke as if sharing a secret, a confidence meant only for her, sparing her the indignity of another public spectacle. He leaned in a fraction closer and whispered the words that would change everything. "Ride with me. I will fill your table tonight." Nora flinched as if he had struck her. Her first instinct was to refuse, to spit the offer back in his face. It felt like another form of charity, a different kind of shame. "I do not take handouts from strangers." "It is not a handout," he replied, his voice even and patient. He was not offended. "It is a ride. The rest is my business." "And what business is that?" she demanded, suspicion sharpening her words. "Why would you do this?" He was quiet for a long moment, his eyes looking past her, toward the jagged peaks in the distance. When he spoke again, his voice was different, distant, as if he were pulling a memory from a long way off. "I was 8 years old. My family was wintering in the Nebraska sandhills. A blizzard came and we lost our stock. We ate the last of the cornmeal, and then there was nothing. For 3 days, there was nothing. My belly was so empty it ached worse than a beating. I remember my father just sitting by the cold stove, staring at his hands. Then a man came, a trapper. He did not say much. He just looked at my PA, and then at my sister and me. He went to his wagon and came back with a side of bacon and a small sack of flour. He put them on the table and left. He did not ask for thanks or payment. He just saw what needed seeing." He brought his gaze back to her, and the distance was gone, replaced by a profound and simple understanding. "That is not charity, ma'am. It is just seeing. Now, I have a wagon and a pair of stout mules, and I am going out to Jensen's trading post before he closes. You and the boy can ride along." His story disarmed her. It was not a plea, but an explanation. He was not offering help from a position of superiority, but from a place of shared human experience. He knew the specific, hollow ache of hunger. He was not looking down on her. He was looking straight at her. And for the first time since her husband had died, she felt truly seen. The fight went out of her, replaced by a weariness so deep it was a physical weight. Her pride was a cold comfort, and it would not feed her son. She gave a single sharp nod. The wagon was sturdy, its bed filled with canvas-covered bundles. Colt helped her up onto the seat, then lifted Eli and placed him between them. The boy looked small and lost on the wide bench. Colt untied the mules, and with a low word and a flick of the reins, they were moving. The iron-shod wheels of the wagon protested, grinding and shrieking against the frozen ruts in the street as they turned and headed out of town. The biting wind was worse now that they were moving, and Nora huddled deeper into her shawl, pulling Eli close. They rode in silence for a while. The only sounds the clatter of the harness, the snorting of the mules, and the relentless cry of the wind. The landscape was stark and unforgiving, a rolling sea of brown and white under a vast, indifferent sky. The mountains seemed to get no closer, a permanent, broken wall on the horizon. The breath of the mules and the people on the wagon plumed in the air, white clouds of fleeting warmth instantly snatched away by the cold. After they had traveled a mile or so, Colt spoke, his eyes on the trail ahead. "Jensen's is not like Pritchard's. He trades. He does not ask questions." Nora said nothing, just held her son tighter. The trading post was little more than a solid log cabin with a lean-to barn, set in a shallow creek bottom that offered some protection from the wind. A thin curl of smoke rose from its stone chimney. A man with a thick beard and a stoic expression, Jensen, came out as they pulled up. He nodded at Colt. "Mercer," he grunted. "Jensen," Colt replied. He swung down from the wagon and began untying the canvas on one of the bundles. He pulled it back to reveal a stack of expertly cured beaver and muskrat pelts, along with the trussed carcass of a fat doe. Jensen inspected the furs with a practiced eye, then hefted the deer. He gave another curt nod. "Good weight, prime pelts. What do you need?" "Flour," Colt said. "Cornmeal, beans, salt pork, lard, coffee, a tin of molasses." Jensen disappeared inside and returned a few minutes later, his arms laden. He loaded heavy cloth sacks and paper-wrapped parcels into the back of the wagon. It was more food than Nora had seen in one place in over a year. It was a week's worth. Maybe more. The transaction was completed without another word. Colt tied down the new supplies, and they started back the way they had come. The return journey was quieter, the wind seeming to have lessened its assault as evening approached. The silver light of dusk settled over the land, softening its harsh edges. The silence in the wagon felt different now, less tense. "My husband's name was Thomas," Nora said suddenly, her voice quiet. She did not know why she was telling him this. "He was a good man, a strong man. He thought we could make a go of it out here. He built our cabin with his own hands." She paused, her gaze lost in the darkening landscape. "The pneumonia took him in 3 days. That was last spring. I have been trying to hold on since." She did not speak of the failed crops, the loneliness, or the bone-deep fear that was her constant companion. She did not have to. It was all there in the simple, stark facts of her story. Colt did not offer empty condolences. He just nodded, his hand steady on the reins. It is hard country for a man alone, harder still for a woman. They reached her homestead as the last light faded from the sky. It was a small, lonely cabin, looking fragile and out of place against the vast emptiness. The wind whistled through the chinks in the log walls. Colt pulled the wagon up to the door and set the brake. He did not just leave the supplies. He climbed down and began unloading them, carrying the heavy sacks into the cabin himself. Nora scrambled to follow, lighting the single kerosene lamp on the table. In its wavering yellow glow, the poverty of the room was laid bare: a rough table with 2 chairs, a stone hearth, a bed in the corner, and little else. Colt set the last of the food on the floor and looked around. Without a word, he went back outside, returning a moment later with an armload of firewood from a small pile near the door. He knelt at the hearth and, with practiced efficiency, had a fire crackling in minutes. The warmth began to push back the chill. Nora, moving as if in a dream, began to unpack the food. She ran her hands over a sack of flour as if it were the finest silk. Eli stood by the hearth, soaking in the heat, his eyes wide and fixed on the growing pile of provisions. Nora filled a pot with water and began to make a stew with some of the salt pork and dried beans. Soon, the small cabin was filled with the rich, forgotten smell of cooking food. When it was ready, she ladled it into 3 chipped enamel bowls. They sat at the small table, the man, the woman, and the boy. And for the first time in a very long time, there was enough. Eli ate with a silent, desperate intensity, his spoon moving from the bowl to his mouth without pause, as if he feared the food might vanish before he could finish. He emptied his bowl in minutes and looked down at it with a kind of quiet grief that it was gone. Nora's heart ached watching him. Before she could say anything, Colt reached over and gently pulled the boy's bowl toward him. He ladled another full portion from the pot on the hearth and pushed the bowl back in front of Eli. The boy looked up at Colt, his eyes full of a question he did not know how to ask. Colt met his gaze, and for the first time a genuine, quiet smile touched the corners of his mouth. It was a smile of deep, settled calm. It said more than words ever could. It said, "Eat." It said, "There is more." It said, "For tonight, you are safe." Nora woke to a sound she had not heard in a long time. It was not the mournful cry of the wind slipping through the cracks in the walls, but a steady, rhythmic chopping. Thump, crack, thump, crack. For a moment, disoriented in the pre-dawn gloom, she thought it was Thomas, her husband, up early to split firewood. The familiar ache of loss returned, sharp and sudden. Then she remembered Colt Mercer. She had offered him the floor by the hearth, the warmest spot in the cabin, but he had politely refused, saying he preferred his own bedroll in his wagon, that he was used to the cold. She had not argued. His presence was already a massive, unsettling intrusion on her small, broken world, and the thought of him sleeping just a few feet away was too much to contemplate. Eli was still asleep in their shared bed, a small lump under the threadbare quilt, his breathing deep and even for the first time in weeks, his belly full. She rose quietly and pulled on her dress, her fingers fumbling with the buttons in the cold. Peeking through a gap in the shutters, she saw him, in the gray, frozen light of dawn. Colt was a study in motion. He had already felled a dead pine at the edge of her property and was now methodically working his way through the trunk, his axe rising and falling with an economy of effort that was mesmerizing. Each swing landed precisely, sending chips of wood flying. He was not just chopping wood. He was building a defense against the winter. She busied herself making coffee, a luxury she had not enjoyed in months. When it was hot, she poured a cup into a tin mug and, wrapping her thin shawl around her shoulders, stepped outside. The cold was a physical shock. "Mr. Mercer," she said, her voice small against the vast, cold silence. He stopped, the axe held at rest, and turned to her. His face was flushed from the work, his breath pluming in the air. He looked at the mug in her hand and gave a small nod of thanks as he took it. He drank half of it in one long swallow, the heat a welcome thing. "Thank you, ma'am," he said. He gestured with the axe toward the growing pile of split logs. "This will see you through for a bit." "You did not have to do that," she said, though the words sounded weak and foolish. The neatly stacked wood was a beautiful sight. "The boy needs to be warm," he said simply, as if it were the only explanation required. He finished the coffee and handed the mug back. "That wall on the north side is leaking wind like a sieve, and your roof has more holes than a poor man's prayer." Before she could form a reply, he went back to work. Nora retreated into the relative warmth of the cabin, feeling a strange mix of gratitude and helplessness. By the time Eli was awake and they had eaten a breakfast of fried salt pork and corn cakes, Colt had moved on from the woodpile. He was on the roof, his hammer ringing out a sharp, metallic rhythm as he renailed loose shingles. Eli, drawn by the activity, went outside and stood at a safe distance, watching the man work. He was a small, silent shadow, his hands tucked into his pockets. Colt seemed not to notice him for a long time, but as he climbed down the rickety ladder, he stopped and looked at the boy. "A good foreman keeps an eye on the work," Colt said, his voice serious. Eli's eyes widened, and a tiny, hesitant smile touched his lips. It was the first time Nora had seen him smile in a month. All morning, Colt worked. He mixed mud with dry grass and meticulously chinked the gaps between the logs of the north wall, the side that took the full force of the wind. Nora worked alongside him from inside, pushing the mixture into the cracks. Eli became their assistant, a small, important figure ferrying handfuls of dry grass to Colt. "Good work, son," Colt would say occasionally, and Eli would puff out his chest and hurry back for more. The praise was spare, but it landed like a warm stone in the boy's heart. By midday, the cabin felt different. The relentless drafts were gone. A person could stand by the wall without feeling the cold seep into their bones. But Colt was not finished. "I have to go into town," he announced, wiping his hands on a rag. "I will be back." Nora's heart sank. This was it. He had done more than enough, had provided a meal and a morning of hard labor. Now he would leave, and they would be alone again. The brief respite making the solitude that much harder to bear. She simply nodded, unable to speak. He hitched his mules to the wagon and was gone, the sound of the wheels on the frozen track fading into the wind. The rest of the day passed in a quiet agony of waiting. Nora tried to keep busy, but her eyes kept straying to the empty trail. Eli was subdued again, the morning's brief animation gone. Just as the sun began to dip toward the mountains, she heard the wagon. She rushed to the door, her heart pounding a nervous rhythm. It was him. He was back, and the wagon was not empty. He had brought lumber, not rough logs, but clean, planed boards. He had a small wooden crate filled with nails, a roll of tar paper, and, carefully wrapped in a thick blanket, a single pane of glass. "The window shutter is no way to see the day," he said, carefully lifting the glass from the wagon. Nora stared at the supplies, dumbfounded. This was more than a morning's work. This was an investment. This cost money. "I cannot pay you for this," she whispered, the shame returning. "You do not have to," he said, not looking at her as he began to unload the wood. "I had some wages owed to me from the Morrison ranch. I took it in trade instead of coin. These materials were just sitting in a shed, forgotten. It is no matter." He was lying. She knew it as surely as she knew her own name. But it was a lie told to protect her pride, a piece of fiction constructed as carefully as a new wall. It was a kindness so profound it left her breathless. She accepted it, because to refuse it would be to cheapen the gift. The next hour was a blur of activity. He expertly cut an opening in the south wall and framed it for the window. As the last of the light faded, he set the pane of glass in place, securing it with small nails. For the first time, Nora could look out at her own land through clear glass instead of a dark, drafty shutter. It was like seeing the world anew. It was then that they heard the horses. 2 riders were coming up the trail from town. Nora recognized them immediately, and her stomach clenched. It was Frank Dawson and another of Morrison's hands, a man named Riley. They reined in their horses a few yards from the cabin, their expressions a mixture of curiosity and contempt. "Well now, Dawson," Riley said, his voice carrying easily in the still air. "Looks like the widow Hayes has found herself a carpenter." Frank Dawson's eyes roamed over the new wood, the stacked firewood, and rested on Colt. A slow, unpleasant smile spread across his face. "Doing some improvements, are we?" he called out, his tone thick with insinuation. He looked from Colt to Nora, who stood frozen in the cabin doorway. "A man does that kind of hard work. He expects to be compensated. Is that not right, Nora?" The meaning was ugly and unmistakable. They were not just asking questions. They were passing judgment, painting her as a woman trading favors for a roof over her head. The blood drained from Nora's face. Colt, who had been putting his tools away, slowly straightened up. He did not say a word. He simply turned to face the 2 men. He did not reach for the pistol on his hip. He did not have to. His stillness was more menacing than any threat. He stood tall and solid, his hands at his sides, his pale eyes fixed on Dawson. The silence stretched, becoming a palpable thing, heavy with unspoken violence. He was a wall they would not get past. The confrontation pushed something in Nora. All the shame, the fear, the quiet indignities she had endured it all coalesced into a single, hard point of anger. They were not just insulting her. They were defiling the first safe place she had known in months. They were doing it in front of her son, who had retreated behind her skirts. She stepped forward from the doorway, out into the cold yard. She put herself between Colt and the riders. Her voice, when she spoke, did not tremble. It was as cold and hard as the frozen ground beneath her feet. "This is my land," she said, her eyes locked on Frank Dawson. "You are not welcome here. Get off!" Dawson's smirk faltered. He had expected tears or a timid retreat, not this quiet, unyielding fury. He looked from her to the silent figure of Colt Mercer and back again. He was not a brave man, only a cruel one. He saw there was nothing for him to win here. He tugged on his reins. "Just being neighborly," he muttered, an empty excuse. He and Riley turned their horses and rode away, their laughter floating back, thin and brittle in the twilight air. Nora stood watching them go, her body trembling with the aftermath of the confrontation. She felt a hand on her shoulder, firm and steady. It was Colt. "You did well," he said quietly. She turned to look at him, and in the dim light she saw a flicker of respect in his eyes. He had defended her without a word, but more than that, he had created a space where she could defend herself. That night, the wind howled and screamed around the small cabin, a wild beast trying to get in. But for the first time, it stayed outside, inside. The fire burned bright. The new window held firm against the gale, and the walls were silent. The warmth was not just from the fire. It was the heat of a newfound security, a trust that had been earned not with promises, but with the solid, irrefutable evidence of a stack of firewood, a pane of glass, and a quiet man who knew when to stand still. Before he left for his wagon, Colt finished stacking the last of the wood he had split. He did it with the same care he did everything. Each piece fitted against the next, creating a solid, orderly wall of fuel. It was more than a woodpile. It was a promise of warmth for the days to come. It was the beginning of a new order. The days that followed settled into a new and unfamiliar rhythm. A rhythm of quiet work and shared space. Each morning, just as the sky began to lighten from black to a deep, bruised purple, Nora would hear Colt's footsteps approaching from the creek bed where he had made his camp. He would arrive with the dawn and leave with the dusk. A silent promise kept without a single word spoken. His presence filled the small homestead not with noise, but with purpose. He began to teach Eli. The lessons were not from books, but from the land itself. He showed the boy how to tie a bowline knot, his large, calloused hands moving with surprising dexterity as he explained. This knot will not slip. No matter how hard you pull, it is a knot you can trust. Eli, his face a mask of concentration, would practice for hours with a small piece of rope until his small fingers mastered the movements. They set a line of simple snare traps in the brush for rabbits and squirrels, and Colt taught Eli how to check them, how to read the tracks in the snow, and how to be quiet and patient. The wild does not give its secrets to a noisy man, he told the boy, his voice a low rumble. He taught him how to read the clouds, pointing out the mare's tails that foretold wind and the heavy, gray underbellies that promised more snow. For Nora, it was like coming up for air after a long time underwater. The constant, crushing weight of solitary survival began to lift. She could spend an hour mending clothes by the light of her new window without worrying if the woodpile was getting low. She could focus on baking bread without the gnawing fear of what they would eat tomorrow. She found herself watching the man and the boy from the window, a strange warmth spreading in her chest. She saw how Colt never coddled Eli, but treated him with a quiet respect, giving him real tasks and praising him for a job well done. He was becoming the father Eli had lost, and the partner Nora had never truly had. The cabin was no longer just a shelter. It was slowly, tentatively, becoming a home. This new arrangement, however, did not go unnoticed. One afternoon, a buggy pulled up to the homestead. It was not a farmer's wagon, but the town buggy, and from it descended Sheriff Hale and Asa Pritchard. They approached the cabin with a stiff, self-important air of men on official business. Colt was showing Eli how to properly sharpen an axe head, and he did not stop his work. He merely looked up, his expression unreadable, and waited. "Mrs. Hayes," Sheriff Hale began, removing his hat. He was a man who performed his civility like a part in a play. "Mr. Pritchard and I were just concerned. We heard you had taken on a hired man." "Mr. Mercer has been helping with repairs," Nora said, stepping out of the cabin to stand beside Colt. She would not let them talk about him as if he were not there. Asa Pritchard cleared his throat, his gaze flicking around the tidy yard. The stacked wood, the neatly chinked walls. "It is an unusual arrangement. You must admit, a woman alone, with a man who is not family. People in town are talking. It is a matter of propriety, of your good name." "My good name is my own concern," Nora said, her voice steady. "And Mr. Mercer's work has been a godsend. He has done nothing but good for me and my son." The sheriff sighed, a put-upon sound. "Now, Nora, we are just trying to protect you. A town has to have standards. For a man to be spending all his days here, it gives the wrong impression. Colt carefully set the axe head down. He wiped his hands on a rag and turned to face the two men. His voice, when he spoke, was calm and reasonable, but there was an underlying layer of steel that both men heard clearly. "I understand your concern for the lady's reputation," he said, "and I would be the last man to bring any dishonor to her door. From now on, I will keep my camp by the creek. I will not sleep under her roof, or even on her land. I will be here only during daylight hours to work. That should satisfy the town's standards. I expect—" Hale and Pritchard were taken aback. They had come expecting a confrontation, perhaps a heated argument that would prove their point. Instead, they were met with a quiet, logical solution that stripped them of their moral high ground. Colt was not just agreeing with them. He was showing them what true honor looked like. It was not about appearances. It was about doing the right thing in a way that protected everyone. "Well," the sheriff stammered, putting his hat back on, "yeah, that would be a more proper arrangement." They made their excuses and left, their buggy rattling away down the trail, their mission of moral instruction having dissolved into an awkward retreat. That evening, as Colt was gathering his things to head back to his camp, a new tension hung in the air. He had solved one problem, but his solution had created another. It had put a timeline on his presence. "You do not have to do that," Nora said quietly, nodding toward his bedroll. "Their talk is just wind." "Sometimes wind can blow a house down," he replied. He looked at her, his gaze serious. "I could stay on for a while longer. There is still the barn roof to see to before the heavy snows come. I could help you get through the winter." Fear, cold and familiar, coiled in Nora's stomach. A promise. It felt like a promise. And promises had a way of breaking. Her husband had promised they would build a life here, and now he was in the ground. Hope was a dangerous thing, a flickering candle in a high wind. "I cannot pay you," she said, the old excuse rising to her lips. "I am not asking for pay." Why, she asked, the word a raw whisper. "Why are you doing all this?" He considered the question for a long moment. "Maybe I am just tired of moving," he said at last. "Maybe I just want to see a job through to the end." He saw the fear in her eyes, the deep, ingrained distrust of good fortune. He understood it. He did not push. "Let us not make any promises," he said, his voice softening. "We will just let the work speak for the words. How about that?" She looked at him, at his steady eyes and his patient expression, and felt a small, fragile piece of her fear recede. The work was real. The solid walls, the warm hearth, the full larder, those things were real. She could trust those. She gave a small nod. "All right," she said. "Let the work speak." The days shortened and the cold deepened. Christmas was approaching. There was no money for gifts or celebration, but a new feeling had taken root in the small cabin. It was not happiness, not yet, but it was a kind of peace, a quiet contentment. On Christmas Eve, Colt came back from the woods not with firewood, but with the top of a small pine tree. It was barely 3 feet tall, but it was perfectly shaped. He set it up in a corner of the cabin, and Eli's eyes grew wide with wonder. They had no ornaments, but its fresh, clean scent filled the room, a perfume of life in the midst of the dead of winter. That evening, after their meal, Colt reached into his coat pocket. He pulled out a small, flat object wrapped in a piece of clean cloth. He held it out to Nora. "Merry Christmas, Nora," he said, using her first name for the first time. Her hands trembled as she took it and unwrapped the cloth. It was a comb. It was made of dark, polished wood, simple and unadorned, but carved with a skill that made it beautiful. It was a practical thing, but also an intimate one. It was a gift that said he saw her not just as a widow or a mother, but as a woman. She could not speak. She just clutched the comb in her hand, the smooth wood a comfort against her palm. He then turned to Eli and handed him a small, carved wooden horse, its lines simple but full of life. Eli gasped and took it with a reverence usually reserved for prayer. They sat in silence for a moment, the only sounds the crackle of the fire and the whisper of the wind outside. Eli was running a small finger over the horse's wooden mane. He looked up, his face full of a simple, uncomplicated joy. "Thank you, Pa," he said. The word dropped into the quiet room like a stone into a still pond. The silence that followed was absolute. Nora's breath caught in her throat. Eli's eyes widened. As if surprised by what he had said, he looked from Colt's face to his mother's, a sudden fear dawning that he had done something wrong. Colt did not move. His gaze was fixed on Nora, waiting. His face was a mask, but she could see the tension in the set of his jaw. Everything hung in that moment. It was a crossroads, a choice that would define their future. She thought of Thomas, the grief a familiar, dull ache. But then she looked at her son, at the hope in his eyes, and at the quiet, steady man who had rebuilt their world, piece by painstaking piece. He had asked for no promises, only for the work to speak, and it had. It had spoken of strength, of honor, and of a kindness so deep it felt like coming home. Slowly, deliberately. Nora reached out and put her hand on Eli's shoulder. She looked at Colt, and across the flickering firelight, she gave him a small, almost imperceptible nod. It was an answer. It was permission. It was acceptance. A long, slow breath eased out of Colt. The tension in his shoulders relaxed. He reached out and placed his large hand gently on top of Eli's head. His voice, when he spoke, was thick with an emotion he did not name. "You are welcome, son." The word hung in the air of the small cabin for days, unspoken but ever present. Pa. It had been said once, naturally and without thought, but now it echoed in the quiet spaces between them. When Eli spoke to Colt, he would hesitate for a fraction of a second, a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes before settling on a simple Colt. But the name had been given, the connection forged. They had, without planning or discussion, become a family in everything but name. The change was palpable. There was an ease between Nora and Colt now, a shared understanding that went beyond gratitude for work done. They moved around each other in the small space with a familiar grace, their tasks interwoven. He would bring in water from the creek, and she would have the coffee pot all ready on the hearth. She would mend a tear in his shirt, and he would whittle a new handle for her worn-out broom. It was a partnership, built piece by piece, like the cabin walls he had fortified. This quiet domesticity, however, was a fire that sent smoke signals straight to Ash Hollow. The story of Colt's work at the Hayes homestead, once a curiosity, was now a full-blown scandal, fanned by the malicious winds of gossip. Frank Dawson, nursing his bruised ego, made sure to tell anyone who would listen that Mercer was a drifter with his eyes on the widow's land. Asa Pritchard, his authority challenged, spoke darkly of unpaid debts and the moral failings of those who lived on the fringes. And the good ladies of the town's church auxiliary, their needles clicking as fast as their tongues, stitched together a narrative of brazen impropriety. The fact that Colt Mercer now camped by the creek was not seen as an act of honor, but as a flimsy, transparent attempt to hide what they were all certain was happening after dark. The pressure, as always, was applied to the weakest point. It came in the form of a visit from the preacher, Reverend Miller, and Mrs. Gable, the self-appointed guardian of the town's moral fiber. They arrived one afternoon when Colt was out checking the trap lines with Eli. Nora saw their buggy coming and her heart tightened. She smoothed her apron and met them at the door, her expression carefully neutral. "Mrs. Hayes," the Reverend began, his voice oozing a practiced, syrupy concern. "We have come as friends." "Of course," Nora said, though she did not invite them in. "Mrs. Gable," a woman whose face seemed permanently pinched in disapproval, took over. "My dear, we are worried about you, about the example you are setting. To have this man, a complete stranger, living here in such a way, it is simply not done. It invites talk, vicious talk. Mr. Mercer has been a help to me, Nora stated, her voice flat. He works hard, and he has been kind to my son. Kindness can be a cloak for other intentions, the Reverend intoned gravely. We are thinking of your soul, Nora, and of the boy. What must he think, seeing his mother in such a close association? He thinks Mr. Mercer is a good man, Nora countered, a spark of anger cutting through her composure. He thinks he is safe and warm and has food in his belly. That is what he thinks. But at what cost, Mrs.? Gable pressed, her voice rising. Your reputation is in tatters. For your own good, for the good of the community, you must send him away. You must rely on the Lord and the charity of your decent neighbors. The hypocrisy of it was breathtaking. The decent neighbors who had watched her starve. The charity that had never been offered. She looked at them, at their clean clothes and their well-fed faces, and she saw them for what they were, vultures circling what they thought was a dying animal. But she was not dying. She was standing on a solid floor, in front of a warm hearth, with a full larder behind her. She was stronger than they knew. Thank you for your concern, she said, her voice dropping to a dismissive calm. But my arrangements are my own. Now, if you will excuse me, I have bread in the oven. She turned and went back inside, closing the door firmly in their shocked faces. When Colt and Eli returned an hour later, she told him what had happened. She relayed the conversation verbatim, her voice tight with residual anger. Colt listened without interruption, his expression unchanging. He stood by the new window, looking out at the vast, empty landscape as she spoke. When she was finished, he remained silent for a long time, so long that the silence itself became an answer. She saw the muscles in his jaw working. She expected him to curse, to rage against the injustice of it. She expected him to offer to ride into town and confront the Reverend, or Dawson, or the whole sanctimonious lot of them. He did none of those things. He did not fall into the trap they had set. An angry outburst would only confirm their worst assumptions about him, that he was a rootless, violent drifter. He knew that a fight would not solve this. It would only make Nora's life harder. There was only one way to fight this, and it was not with fists or with anger. It was with a truth so plain and so binding that not even the most vicious gossip could tear it down. That night, after Eli was asleep, a heavy quiet settled over the cabin. The fire cast long, dancing shadows on the walls. Nora sat mending one of Eli's shirts, her needle moving in and out of the worn fabric. Colt sat across from her, cleaning a rifle part, his movements slow and deliberate. Finally, he set the metal part down and looked at her, his pale eyes serious in the firelight. They will not stop, he said, his voice low. The talk. It will only get worse. They will keep pushing until they break you, or until I leave, and I am not going to leave. Nora's needle stopped. She looked up at him, her heart beginning to beat a slow, heavy rhythm against her ribs. Then what are we to do? She whispered. He leaned forward, his forearms resting on his knees. He was not a man of fancy words or grand gestures. Everything about him was rooted in the practical, the real, the solid earth. His proposal was no different. There is only one thing to do, he said, his gaze holding hers. We make it official. We stand up in the church, in front of God and anyone who cares to watch, and we bind ourselves together. We give them a truth they cannot deny. He took a breath. Nora, I am asking you to be my wife. The word struck her with the force of a physical blow. Marriage. It was a word she had banished from her thoughts, a door she had locked and bolted forever. To open it again seemed an act of terrifying, reckless hope. All her fears rose up. The fear of loss, the fear of trusting, the fear of letting another person into the fragile fortress of her heart. He saw the conflict in her face. I am not your first husband, he said gently. I cannot replace him. I can only be who I am. I do not promise you riches. I do not promise an easy life. This land will always be hard. I promise to stay. I promise to work. I promise to stand between you and the boy and anything that tries to harm you. I promise to be your husband and a father to your son." She looked at him, really looked at him. She saw the lines of exhaustion around his eyes, the calluses on his hands, the quiet strength in the set of his shoulders. He was not offering her a dream. He was offering her a reality, a partnership forged in mud and winter and shared labor. He was offering her a future built not on empty promises, but on the solid foundation of what he had already done. The fear was still there, a cold knot in her stomach. But for the first time, something else was stronger. It was the courage she had found when she stood up to Dawson, the strength she had discovered when she closed the door on the Reverend. It was a new and unfamiliar feeling. It was hope. "Yes," she said, the word a quiet breath. "Yes, I will." A visible wave of relief washed over his face. He reached into the small leather pouch he always wore on his belt and pulled something out. He unrolled the bit of leather on the table between them. Lying on it was a ring. It was a simple band of silver, worn smooth with age, with a simple, unadorned design etched into it. "It was my mother's. He said, 'It is all I have of her.'" He picked it up and held it out, trembling. She extended her left hand. He slid the cool, heavy silver onto her finger. It was a perfect fit. It was not a symbol of a new beginning, but of a continuation. It was a vow as simple, as durable, and as real as the metal itself. They were married 2 days later. The sky was a high, brilliant blue, but the air was still bitingly cold. The small church in Ash Hollow was nearly empty. Reverend Miller performed the service, his voice stiff and disapproving, but he could not refuse. The law was the law. Frank Dawson and a few of his friends loitered outside, their smirks and jeers a petty, impotent protest. The good ladies of the town were nowhere to be seen. But they were not entirely alone. Jensen, the trader, had closed his post for an hour to be there. He stood as Colt's witness, his bearded face impassive, his presence a silent statement of support. An elderly couple who ran a small ranch a few miles north of Nora's homestead, the Petersons, sat in the front pew. They were quiet folk who kept to themselves, but they knew what it was to struggle, and they knew decency when they saw it. Nora wore her best dress, a simple gray wool that she had mended and pressed in her hair. She wore the wooden comb Colt had given her for Christmas. She stood beside him, tall and straight, the silver ring on her finger a solid, comforting weight. When the Reverend pronounced them man and wife, Colt did not kiss her. He simply took her hand, his large, warm hand closing around hers, and held it tight. They walked out of the church and into the cold, bright sunlight. They were no longer a widow and a drifter, an object of gossip and speculation. They were Mr. and Mrs. Colt Mercer, a family, bound and declared. They had met the town's judgment not with anger or with shame, but with a public act of commitment. It was their answer. It was their justice. The marriage did not silence the town, but it changed the nature of the talk. The gossip continued, a low, persistent hum like mosquitoes in summer, but it had lost its power to inflict a mortal wound. Nora and Colt Mercer were now a fact, a legal and public entity, and the town, however grudgingly, had to make a place for them in its rigid order. The wedding had not won them acceptance, but it had earned them a sliver of ground on which to stand, and from that ground they began to build. As the iron grip of winter finally began to loosen, and the snow receded to reveal the muddy, wounded earth, the reality of their situation became clear. They had food and a warm shelter, but they had no money. A homestead required cash for the things a person could not grow or build: salt, sugar, coffee, tools, and the yearly taxes that were as certain as the seasons. Colt's honor had been satisfied by protecting Nora, but his pride demanded he be a provider in the fullest sense of the word. One morning, he rode out not toward his trap lines, but toward the sprawling Morrison Ranch. Nora watched him go, a knot of apprehension in her stomach. It was the largest operation in the valley, a place where men like Frank Dawson found regular work. Colt was gone all day. He returned at dusk, weary but with a new set of his jaw. "I have a job," he announced. Swinging down from his mule, "Mr. Morrison needed a hand for the spring calving. $3 a week and found." Nora's relief was so profound it felt like a physical release. $3 a week was a fortune. It was survival. It was a future. The fact that he would be working on the same ranch as their chief tormentor was a risk, but it was one they had to take. Colt's wages began to transform the homestead. He did not bring home coin. Instead, he took his pay in kind, bartering with Morrison for the things they truly needed. The first arrival was a gentle, doe-eyed milk cow with a perpetually surprised expression, whom Eli immediately named Bessie. Her warm, fresh milk was a miracle, a daily luxury that brought a healthy color to Eli's cheeks. Next came a half-dozen scrawny but determined laying hens, whose cackling and scratching brought a new and vibrant life to the quiet yard. With the last of the frost gone from the ground, Colt broke the tough prairie sod behind the cabin. He and Nora worked side by side, their hands in the dirt. Planting the seeds, he had acquired rows of corn and beans, hills of squash, and a precious patch of potatoes. The work was backbreaking, but it was hopeful. Every seed dropped into the dark. Rich earth was an act of faith, a vote for a future that extended beyond the next meal. The homestead was becoming a small, thriving enterprise, a world away from the desperate, crumbling outpost it had been just a few months before. But as the days grew longer and the work outside intensified, the smallness of the cabin became more apparent. They were a family of 3 living in a single room, their lives overlapping in a way that left no space for privacy or individual quiet. It was this realization that prompted the next great project. "A boy needs his own room," Colt declared one evening, looking at Eli, who was fast outgrowing his clothes. A place to keep his things, a place to be himself. And so, the building began again. Colt used his earnings to acquire more lumber, and slowly, painstakingly, a new room began to take shape. An extension off the east side of the cabin, the sound of his saw and hammer became the constant music of the summer. Eli, now a sturdy and capable boy of 8, was his father's shadow, learning to measure boards, hold a nail straight, and drive it home with a few clean strokes. He was growing up before Nora's eyes, his shoulders broadening, his voice losing its childish treble. Inside, Nora worked to make the expanding space a true home. Colt built her shelves, and she filled them with their few possessions, neatly organized for the first time. He built a sturdy ladder that led to the small loft space, which she cleaned and turned into a storage area. The cabin was no longer just a box to keep out the weather. It had rooms. It had order. It had the distinct shape of a life being lived with intention. One afternoon, while Colt was at the ranch, Nora was hanging laundry on a line he had strung between 2 trees. Eli was sitting on the steps, carefully carving a piece of scrap wood with a small knife Colt had given him. "You look at Pa all the time," Eli said, not looking up from his work. The observation was so simple and so true that it caught Nora completely off guard. A hot blush rose from her neck to her cheeks. "I do not," she said, her voice a little too sharp. Eli looked up then, a mischievous glint in his eye. "You do, when he is fixing something, or when he is just sitting by the fire. You look at him." She turned back to her laundry, her heart thumping. The boy saw everything. She was flustered, not because he was wrong, but because he was right. She did watch her husband. She watched his strong, capable hands. She watched the way he moved, with a quiet economy of motion. She watched the way his eyes would crinkle at the corners when he was pleased. She watched him, and a feeling she had thought long dead and buried would stir within her. That evening, as they ate their supper of fresh greens from the garden and Bessie's milk, Eli was quiet, but as Colt rose from the table, Eli looked at his mother and gave her a small, conspiratorial wink. Nora felt the blush return. Colt, catching the silent exchange, looked from one to the other. "What is going on here?" he asked, a hint of amusement in his voice. "Nothing," Nora said quickly. Colt looked at her, his gaze lingering on her flushed cheeks. He did not press, but a low, quiet laugh rumbled in his chest. He knew, in that moment, in that small, shared glance. Something shifted between them. The careful, polite distance they had maintained since their wedding day began to dissolve. The day they finished Eli's room was a day of quiet celebration. It was small, with just enough space for a narrow bed Colt had built, a small crate for his clothes, and a shelf for his treasures, the carved horse, a hawk's feather, a collection of interesting rocks. Eli walked into it as if entering a kingdom. He ran his hand over the smooth wooden bed frame. He carefully arranged his rocks on the shelf. That night, for the first time, he would sleep in his own bed, in his own room. After Eli had gone to bed, a new kind of quiet descended on the main room of the cabin. It was the quiet of two people alone, a quiet filled with unspoken things. Nora sat with her mending, but her hands were still. Colt sat by the hearth, cleaning his rifle, but his movements were slow, distracted. The physical space that had opened up in their house had also opened up a space between them, one that demanded to be acknowledged. Finally, Colt set the rifle aside. He looked at her, his face serious in the flickering firelight. "He is a good boy. Nora, you have raised him well." "We are raising him well," she corrected softly. He nodded. He rose and walked to the kerosene lamp on the table. He stood there for a moment, his back to her. "It is getting late," he said. He reached out and turned the wick down. The bright yellow flame shrank, sputtered, and then vanished, plunging the room into the soft, intimate darkness of the firelight. The shadows danced on the walls, and the world shrank to the small, warm space between the hearth and the bed. He turned to face her. In the dim, red glow, she could see the question in his eyes. He did not move toward her. He waited. He had given her a home, a livelihood, and his name, but he would not take this. It had to be given. She set her mending aside and rose from her chair. She took a step toward him, then another. She stopped in front of him, so close she could feel the heat radiating from his body. She was afraid. The memories of her first husband, of a different touch, a different life, were a ghost in the room. But the man standing before her was not a ghost. He was solid. He was real. He was the man who had seen her, who had stayed. Slowly, she raised her hand and placed it on his chest. She could feel the steady, strong beat of his heart beneath her palm. It was a comforting, reassuring rhythm. He did not move. He just watched her. His breath held. "Colt," she whispered, the name a prayer. He covered her hand with his own. His touch was warm and firm. He brought her hand to his lips and gently kissed her palm. It was a gesture of such tenderness it made her heart ache. He then raised his other hand and gently touched her face, his calloused thumb tracing the line of her jaw. He lowered his head and kissed her. It was not a kiss of hungry passion, but of deep, reverent quiet. It was long and slow, a question and an answer, a promise and a fulfillment. It was a kiss that spoke of long days of labor, of shared meals, of quiet understanding. It wiped away the last of the fear, the last of the ghosts. In his arms, she was not a widow. She was just Nora, his wife. That night, for the first time since Thomas had died, she slept a deep, dreamless sleep. There were no nightmares of winter or hunger, no ghosts of the past. There was only the solid weight of her husband beside her, the steady sound of his breathing a lullaby in the quiet dark. She had not realized until that moment just how long she had been waiting to feel safe. She had found it here, in this small cabin, in the arms of this quiet man. It was a peace so profound it felt like the rarest and most precious of luxuries. The late spring and summer were a season of quiet, relentless construction. They built a life the way Colt had built the new room on the cabin, one solid, well-placed piece at a time. The garden flourished under Nora's patient hand, and the small homestead, once a symbol of failure and despair, became a place of abundance and order. Colt's work at the Morrison Ranch was hard, the days long and draining, but he came home each night to a warm meal, a clean house, and the quiet, steady presence of his wife and son. The peace they had found was a fragile, precious thing. A small, warm cabin in the midst of a vast and often hostile wilderness. But the wilderness had more than one kind of predator. While the Mercers built their life, a different kind of construction was taking place in Ash Hollow. Frank Dawson, who saw Colt's quiet competence and growing favor with Mr. Morrison as a personal affront, began to weave a new story. He planted the seeds in the fertile ground of Pritchard's mercantile, speaking casually to the other ranch hands. "Mercer is a good hand with a rope," he would say, leaning against the counter. "Almost too good. A man like that, he does not stay put. I hear the big outfits in Montana are paying top dollar. A man could make a stake and be gone before the first snow." The idea, once planted, grew quickly. It was a plausible lie, fitting the town's original narrative of Colt as a rootless drifter. Asa Pritchard, who still felt the sting of their defiance, watered the seed. When a customer would mention the improvements at the old Hayes place, he would purse his lips and shake his head. "A lot of work for a man who is just passing through," he would muse, his voice carrying through the store. And that wedding was a rushed affair. Wasn't it? Makes a person wonder if there was not a reason for the hurry. The whispers combined, creating a single-pay, poisonous narrative. Colt Mercer was a cunning drifter who had taken advantage of a desperate widow, fixing up her property just enough to sell it from under her before disappearing, leaving her worse off than before. It was a story that satisfied everyone's initial prejudices, and it spread through the town like a fever. The story eventually reached Sheriff Hale, who saw it not as a matter of truth, but as a potential disruption to the town's peace. He rode out to the Mercer homestead one afternoon, his expression troubled. "Colt," he said, getting straight to the point, "there is talk in town that you are planning on pulling up stakes, selling this place and heading for Montana." Colt, who was repairing a piece of harness, did not look up from his work. "Who is saying that?" "Folks are saying it," Hale said evasively. "The point is, you have put a lot of work in here. You have a wife and son. It would be a bad business to just abandon them." "This is my home." "Sheriff," Colt said, his voice low and even, "I am not going anywhere." "I am glad to hear it," Hale said, though he did not look convinced. "Just see that you do not. A man's word should be his bond." The visit left a chill in the air that had nothing to do with the weather. The peace they had built was under assault. The town was not just watching them anymore. It was actively working against them, trying to tear down what they had built with lies and suspicion. The first sign of the real storm came a week later. The day began with an unnatural, heavy stillness. The sky was a strange, yellowish gray, and the air was thick and humid. A late-season storm was brewing in the mountains, a final, violent spasm of winter before the full onset of summer. By midday, the temperature had plummeted and a hard, sleeting rain began to fall. By late afternoon, the rain had turned to snow, thick, wet flakes that clung to every surface, driven by a rising, shrieking wind. "Get the animals in," Colt said, his eyes on the churning sky. "This is going to be a bad one." He and Eli herded the chickens into their coop and secured the door. Nora brought Bessie into the small, sturdy barn Colt had repaired. It was not much more than a lean-to, but it was shelter. As darkness fell, the blizzard hit with full, terrifying force. The world beyond their window dissolved into a swirling vortex of white. The wind howled like a hungry wolf, rattling the new glass pane in its frame. They ate their supper in the flickering lamplight. The roar of the storm, a constant, menacing presence. Suddenly, another sound cut through the wind's cry, a deeper, rumbling roar. "The creek," Colt said, his head snapping up. The spring thaw, combined with the sudden, heavy downpour, had turned their gentle creek into a raging torrent. They could feel a vibration through the floorboards of the cabin. The water was rising fast, and the barn was right in its path. Just as the thought formed, there was a sickening crack of splintering wood from outside, followed by a terrified lowing from Bessie. "The big cottonwood upstream must have come down," Colt said, already pulling on his heavy coat. "It has probably dammed the creek and is pushing the water into the barn." "Eli is not here," Nora said, her voice rising in panic as she scanned the room. "He went out to give Bessie some extra hay just before the worst of it hit. He must still be in the barn." The world tilted on its axis. Colt was out the door in a second, Nora right behind him, grabbing the storm lantern from its hook by the door. The moment they stepped outside, the storm hit them like a physical blow. The wind tore the breath from their lungs, and the snow was a solid, blinding wall of white. The light from the lantern cast a pathetic, wavering circle, illuminating a scene of chaos. The creek had become a churning brown river, already lapping at the foundations of the barn. A massive cottonwood tree lay across the narrow channel, diverting the full force of the current against the small structure. The barn was groaning under the pressure, the water swirling around its base, the weight of the heavy, wet snow threatening to collapse the roof. Colt fought his way through the wind and the rising water to the barn door. It was jammed, swollen shut by the water. "Eli!" he roared, his voice barely audible above the storm. A faint, terrified cry came from within. From the direction of the town, 2 more lights appeared, bobbing in the darkness. It was Sheriff Hale and Frank Dawson, drawn by the commotion or perhaps on their way to deliver another warning. They reined in their horses at the edge of the floodwaters, their faces pale and shocked in the lantern light. They just sat there, watching, paralyzed by the storm's fury. Colt did not spare them a glance. He grabbed a heavy fence post and, using it as a lever, finally managed to pry the barn door open. The scene inside was terrifying. Eli was huddled on a small, raised platform in the corner, his face streaked with tears. Bessie was in a panic, lowing in terror as the muddy water swirled around her legs. The main roof beam was sagging ominously, a long, dark crack running its length. The entire structure was moments from collapse. "Nora, hold the light steady," Colt yelled. "Keep it right on the beam." He disappeared into the swirling snow and returned a moment later, dragging a long, heavy log and carrying a coil of rope. He waded into the barn, the icy water soaking him to the waist. "Eli, listen to me," he said, his voice calm and commanding amidst the chaos. "I am going to get Bessie out first. Then you. Do you understand the boy?" His fear giving way to his father's steady presence, nodded. Colt worked with a desperate, focused energy. He looped the rope around the terrified cow's neck and, half pulling, half guiding her, led her out of the collapsing barn and onto higher ground. Then he went back in. "The roof is going," Dawson shouted from his horse, his voice thin with fear. "Get out of there!" Colt ignored him. He wedged the heavy log under the cracking beam, creating a temporary brace. He sloshed through the water to Eli. "All right, son, on my back." He lifted the boy and settled him on his shoulders. Just as he turned to leave, the brace slipped with a loud crack. The roof sagged another foot. He lunged for the doorway, shielding Eli with his own body as splintered wood and chunks of sod rained down around them. He stumbled out into the storm, setting Eli down on solid ground. Nora rushed to her son, wrapping him in her arms, her body trembling with relief. Colt stood for a moment, breathing heavily, soaked and exhausted. He turned and looked at the 2 men on their horses. Hale and Dawson just stared, their faces a mixture of awe and shame. They had been witnesses, nothing more. Colt walked toward them, his steps slow and deliberate. He stopped in front of the sheriff's horse. The wind whipped his wet hair across his face, but his eyes were clear and burning with a cold fire. "You came out here to talk to me about my honor." Sheriff Colt's voice was quiet, but it cut through the wind's howl. "You came to lecture me about my word." He gestured back toward the ruined barn, toward Nora and Eli huddled together in the lantern light. "Honor is not something you talk about," he said, his voice hard as iron. "It is not in the whispers you listen to in a warm store. It is what a man does when the storm comes. It is what he builds and what he protects." A third rider approached, a large man on a powerful horse. It was Mr. Morrison. He had seen the lights and ridden out to investigate. He took in the scene at a glance: the flooded creek, the destroyed barn, the shivering boy, and the two silent, shamed men on their horses. "What is going on here?" Hale Morrison demanded, his voice a low growl of authority. Before the sheriff could stammer a reply, Colt spoke, his eyes still locked on Hale. "The sheriff and Mr. Dawson were just leaving. They have seen what they came to see." Morrison looked at Colt, soaked and shivering but standing tall and unbroken. He looked at Nora, holding the storm lantern, its steady light a beacon of defiance in the raging blizzard. He looked at the family, united and alive. Then he looked at his hired hand, Frank Dawson. "Dawson," he said, his voice flat and cold, "you are fired. Collect your pay in the morning and be off my land." He turned to the sheriff. "Hale, I think you owe this family an apology." The sheriff's face went pale. He looked from Morrison's angry glare to Colt's quiet contempt and finally down at the ground. He mumbled something incoherent and, without another word, turned his horse and rode away, Dawson following like a beaten dog. Just as they disappeared into the swirling snow, the wind seemed to lessen its assault. The thick, heavy flakes began to thin. A patch of sky appeared overhead, and a single, watery star shone through. The storm was breaking. The roar of the creek began to subside. The world, which had been a whirlwind of violent chaos, grew quiet. All that was left was the sound of the wind sighing through the pines and the steady, comforting light of the lantern in Nora's hand. The community had not stood with them, but a part of it had been forced to witness the truth. In the cold, clear air that followed the storm, it was plain for anyone to see the Mercer family was not built of whispers and lies. It was built of something much, much stronger. The dawn that broke after the blizzard was pristine and mercilessly bright. The new snow covered the world in a blanket of clean, brilliant white, hiding the churned mud and the scars of the flood. But the devastation was still there. The barn was a heap of splintered timbers, and the great cottonwood tree lay like a fallen giant, its roots torn from the earth. The world was quiet, scrubbed clean by the storm's fury. Mr. Morrison had stayed, helping Colt ensure Bessie was safely tethered and that Eli was warm back inside the cabin. Now, in the cold morning light, he stood with Colt, surveying the damage. He was a man who measured other men not by their words, but by the work of their hands and the steel in their spines. He had seen everything he needed to see the night before. "That was a fool thing you did, Mercer," Morrison said, his voice a low rumble. He was not scolding him. It was a statement of fact, going into a collapsing barn like that. Colt looked at the cabin, where a warm yellow light glowed in the new window. "I did what had to be done." "Yes," Morrison said, a note of deep respect in his voice. "You did." He pulled a cigar from his coat pocket but did not light it, just rolled it between his fingers. "My head wrangler is moving on to California come summer. The job is yours if you want it, $5 a week. There is a small house that goes with it, closer to the main ranch. It is dry and sturdy. You could move your family in right away." It was an offer of a different life, a life of stability, of a steady wage, of a house that did not need constant repair. It was everything Nora had ever wanted, everything her first husband had tried and failed to give her. It was safety. Colt looked at the small homestead, at the cabin he had rebuilt, the garden plot sleeping under the snow, the new room he had added for his son. "I thank you for the offer. Mr. Morrison, it is more than generous. I will take the job, but I need to talk to my wife about the house." Morrison nodded. "Understanding. You do that. The job is yours regardless." He mounted his horse, then paused, looking back at Colt. "I was wrong about you. Mercer, the whole town was—" He turned and rode away, his horse leaving the first new tracks in the fresh snow. Colt and Nora discussed the offer over breakfast, the words soft in the warm, quiet cabin. The idea of the ranch house was a powerful lure. It was a life without the constant, gnawing worry of survival. But as they spoke, they both kept looking around the small room, at the solid walls, the shelves Colt had built, the silver ring on Nora's finger. "This place," Nora said, her voice thick with emotion. "We built this, not just the walls, us." Colt reached across the table and took her hand. I know. He had spent his entire life moving from one place to another, never putting down roots, fearing that to stay in one place was to be trapped. But here, in this small, hard-scrabble homestead, he had not found a trap. He had found an anchor. "We will take his offer for the job," Nora said, a new strength in her voice. "But this is our home. We will not leave it." "It needs a name, then," Colt said, a small smile touching his lips. "A place this hard-won deserves a name." Nora looked out the window, at the morning sun glinting off the pristine snow, at the promise of a new day after the storm. "Hope Creek," she said softly, "because this is the place where I learned how to hope again." The weeks that followed brought a sea change, the story of the storm, of Eli's rescue, and of Colt's quiet heroism in the face of Hale and Dawson's cowardice, had a power that no amount of gossip could overcome. It was a simple, dramatic truth that people could understand. Morrison's public backing and the firing of Frank Dawson sealed it. The tide of public opinion, which had been so set against them, slowly, irrevocably, turned. The next time Nora went to Ash Hollow for supplies, the change was palpable. As she walked toward the mercantile, one of the Petersons, the elderly couple who had attended their wedding, tipped his hat to her. "Mrs. Mercer," he said, his voice warm with respect. Inside the store, Asa Pritchard was a different man. The condescending smirk was gone, replaced by a clipped, professional courtesy. He measured out her flour and weighed her coffee beans without a single judgmental comment. He was a businessman, and he knew that the Mercers, with a steady wage of $5 a week, were now valuable customers. His power had been in the granting or withholding of credit, in the social shame he could inflict. They had taken that power away from him, not by fighting him, but by simply no longer needing him. Justice, Nora realized, was not always a grand, public affair. Sometimes, it was just a man being forced to sell you goods at a fair price, his eyes never quite meeting yours. As she was leaving, Jensen, the trader, who was in town for supplies, stopped her on the boardwalk. He nodded toward her wagon. "Heard you lost your barn." "We did," Nora confirmed. "I have got some seasoned lumber at my post, too good for firewood. You tell Colt to come see me. We will work something out." It was not an offer of charity. It was a gesture of solidarity from one practical, hard-working person to another. The wall of isolation that had surrounded her for so long was finally crumbling. Summer arrived, and Hope Creek healed. Colt, with the help of a now sturdy and confident Eli, built a new barn, stronger and better situated than the last. The garden, tended by Nora's loving hands, exploded with life. The corn grew tall and green, the squash vines spread, and the chickens scratched happily in the warm dust. The days were long and full of satisfying labor, and the nights were quiet and full of a deep, settled peace. One warm evening in late summer, Nora and Colt sat on the small porch he had built, watching the fireflies begin to light up the twilight. Eli was down by the creek, searching for frogs. Nora had been quiet all evening, a thoughtful, secret smile on her face. "The corn is tasseling," Colt said, his voice content. "It is going to be a good harvest." "Yes," Nora said softly. "It is." She placed her hand on her belly, a gesture so natural and unconscious that it took him a moment to register its significance. He turned to look at her, and in the fading light, he saw a glow in her eyes that had nothing to do with the setting sun. "Nora," he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "There will be another harvest. Come winter," she said, her smile finally breaking free. "A new life. Our baby." He stared at her, his heart swelling with an emotion so powerful it left him speechless. A child, their child, a life created not from desperation and sorrow, but from love and hope. Here in this place they had built together. He reached out and gently placed his own large, calloused hand over hers on her belly. He could think of nothing to say, no words big enough to contain the moment. "If it is a girl," Nora whispered, her eyes shining with tears of joy, "I want to name her Hope." The circle was complete. The seeds of kindness planted in the dead of winter had taken root, survived the storms, and were now bearing the most precious fruit of all. The final image of their story was not one of dramatic confrontation or hard-won victory. It was a quiet moment. Months later, as the first golden light of dawn touched the land, the corn stood tall and ripe, a field of green and gold promises. Colt stood at the edge of the field, his son beside him. Eli, who had once been a small, frightened shadow, now stood nearly to his father's shoulder, his expression open and confident. They looked out over the land, their land, together. Colt put his hand on his son's shoulder, a gesture of quiet, unbreakable strength. "Pa is here." "Eli," he said softly, his voice a vow made not just to the boy, but to the land, to his wife, to the new life she carried, and to the future they had built from nothing. Always. Thank you for listening to our story. Please comment where you are listening from so we can all connect and share our thoughts. And do not forget to subscribe to my channel Wild West Night, like the video. And support us further by pressing the hype button so this story can be heard by more people.